I'm here with Dacre Stoker, and Dacre, it's such an honor to speak with you. This is the first time I've ever had any official bona fide horror royalty, so it's been to say it's a pleasure to have you here is a huge understatement. So I really appreciate the time today.
Well, Rick, it's my pleasure, and plus the fact you're a fellow Canadian. So, yeah, even though
I know, right?
I left the country because my bride is American and missed the
Okay.
South. Born and raised in Montreal, although I had to leave in the 80s when Bill 101 kind of forced teachers, out of English-speaking teachers out of the province, and I headed up to Oakville, where I taught
Okay.
at Appleby College for 10 years. And married a gal from South Carolina, and after about a year, she said, "We got to plan our exit." And I was open for a change, but I love it down here. But I've
Yeah.
stayed a Canadian, and I'm proud of my Canadian roots. A lot like Bram Stoker, was an Irishman that moved to London to do his work. But
Yeah.
no, it's great to be here and talk to a fellow Canadian about all things related to Bram Stoker and what I've been able to do with it to sort of keep his legacy alive.
Yeah, no, I think it's incredible, and it's kind of funny as well. And I'm glad that you brought that up as well with your origin, uh, because I think that from the moment that you agreed to chat with me, I thought, how can I not? I'm going to come on here. I'm going to say, I feel like I've crossed an ocean of time to meet with you today, but not really. I mean, I'm actually in Kitchener, Ontario, so Oakville's not that far from me. It's not exactly an ocean away, so.
No, and my mom used to live when she was alive. She used to live in the Thousand Islands area,
Oh,
uh,
okay.
and and so I was
Just
up there
outside of Kingston.
occasionally, and yeah, not far. And I had a couple of
Yeah.
cousins in the area, and I have lots. I mean, anyway, there's no oceans of time, especially with the power of the internet too. But it makes it
Exactly.
a great line in the novel, though. I got to tell you,
Yeah,
good reference.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So it's yeah, no, it's been great to meet with you, and I think it's so incredible that you are keeping the legacy of Bram Stoker alive because and thank you so much as well for giving me a peek at your book Stoker on Stoker. Um, Really fascinating book, holy smokes, because I mean it's amazing to me. I mean the most prominent takeaway that I took for me personally from that book Stoker on Stoker is that you take away the incredible book Dracula and you've still got an absolutely fascinating human being of a person and the things that he's done, the lives that he's touched, the work that he did, even before he started writing. And I was fascinated to know, of course, that he didn't really start writing books until he was about 45. So about really 20 years before his, not even 20 years before his early passing. Even for the days that was still pretty young age to pass away.
Yeah,
And
yeah, no, you're right. I'm really glad, and I know this wasn't a planted advertisement for Stoker on Stoker, but
right,
that's one of the things that really attracted me when you contacted me. Everybody just wants to talk about Dracula, and of course, there's nothing wrong with that. There's so much
sure,
to get into with that book. It's so complex, but Stoker on Stoker is really what I kind of coined the companion book to my lectures and these audiovisual presentations that I take around the world. And Rick, they're always changing because I'm always finding new stuff. Or fellow researchers, we share stuff, we share
yeah,
information. A letter pops up on an auction site, and we get a glimpse of, oh, here's a guy that Bram wrote to, or here's a guy that wanted tickets to the Lyceum Theater, or here's something that's talking about something unrelated to anything we've already known about with Bram and his regular life or his Dracula life. Who is this person? And it opens up
yeah,
doors. It kind of takes us down a bit of a, like a rabbit hole. And when that happens, boom, I get some interesting insight into a relationship, and that becomes a couple of slides or a couple of moments on a presentation. And then of course, whenever I get a chance. And the Stoker on Stoker that you just read is actually my 125th anniversary edition. It's the second edition of
oh,
it,
okay,
which has, more interesting new stuff than the one I published about 4 years ago. And, in a couple of years, I will have accumulated more interesting things about Bram's life, uh, some of the other stories he's written, some of the insight into some of the other members of the family. You know, he was one of 7 kids. So I'm really glad you enjoyed that and got to know Bram a little bit more by looking through that. And it's an easy read. It's not a heavy, work of nonfiction. So yeah, thank you for recognizing that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and thank you again. And I think aside from that main takeaway that I had of what a fascinating individual that Bram was, is also the fact that, and it really blew me away. Maybe even the most fascinating part of that, of reading that book and understanding the history of Bram as a human being, is that even though Dracula is, which was and please correct me if I'm wrong, that was, I believe, his 4th novel, or was it his 5th novel?
It's difficult to answer that question because his early novels, he's had different editions of them. Some of them were serialized. Right. Let's just say it's somewhere between 4th and 5th, because it's not an easy count. It's not as simple as it would be today.
Right, and of course, it was interesting too that he actually wrote his own abridged version of Dracula too. And I've actually passed that by on the shelves, thinking, I don't want to read this. It's just a watered down, condensed version for the I don't know, the fickle population that has a TikTok attention span. But Bram himself actually wrote an abridged version, which I thought was pretty cool.
Rick, let me tell you an interesting story, and sure. This is even something that I haven't had a chance to put in Stoker on Stoker, although, and I'm saying this for the first time ever, in the next 2 weeks, I'm publishing through Hellbound Publishing an annotated version, the 125th anniversary annotated edition of Dracula. I put out a 125th, which I can see on your bookshelf. You have one with that cool cover. But this one is annotated, and it actually shows in grayscale, in the type font, all of the words, the 30,000 plus or minus words that Bram was asked by his publisher to extract from the original manuscript. So what I was lucky enough to use to create that was a early edition, I think a 6th printing of Dracula that my cousins, see, Bram has 2 great-grandsons still alive. They're in their late 70s, one early 80s. And they have some of the cool stuff, some of the things they have donated to libraries, some they had sold to libraries, but they've also kept some really interesting pieces. And one of them is this 6th edition of Dracula that Bram was handed by his publisher, and they said, use this to take out 30,000 words. Now, in our day, Rick, it'd just be on your computer and you'd just go and do strike through or something.
Exactly.
Bram did exactly the same thing with the 6th edition of Dracula with a pencil.
Jeez.
So what you see is lines crossed out, whole paragraphs or sometimes pages with a square around it and an X in pencil. But when he actually got intricate and took out very specific passages, sometimes he had to add a few words to bridge to make sense of what he was taking out. And that's one of the elements of this brand new 125th anniversary annotated edition of Dracula, is you see the grayscale of what was taken out. In a different font, you see the bridge words he put in. You also see references from the Dracula notes that he either put in or took out. And you also see from the typescript, the very last thing that he had in his hands that was typed up and handed to his publisher, what was either taken out or put back in at that stage as well. So it's kind of an interesting study, because back to your original point, this whole sort of, quick, easy read, this whole TikTok look at life, there's more to it, obviously, back in the day. This was for the 1901 edition. And what Bram's publisher was getting at was This book has now sold well in its hardcover form, 485 some odd pages. But now we want to really get it out to mass market, much like they do today with your trade
Mm-hmm.
paperbacks. But what Bram was asked to do was take out anything that might be too complicated for people to understand. And so you'll see any references to Shakespeare, for instance,
Yeah.
and there was a lot of them. Any references to sort of serious, deep sciences or anything that's very complicated, you had to take out. And I'm sure it drove Bram a little crazy because all the studying that I've done and comparing notes with other researchers, Bram loved to insert that stuff. The ideas of the day, the sciences of the day, mesmerism, spiritualism, phrenology, all this stuff. Well, a lot of that was removed for the first paperback abridged edition, just to make it a
It's
quick
so
and easy
frustrating.
read. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially when and you talk about that quite a bit in Stoker on Stoker book as well. That he essentially spent 7 years writing this book, and the amount of research that he put into this was incredible. And the fact that he never, to your knowledge at least, or anybody's knowledge, it sounds like, had even stepped into Transylvania, where the majority of the book takes place. But yet he immersed himself in the research so heavily in with that you would think that he was one of the locals the way that he talked about that, which I thought was pretty mind-boggling.
It's telling, Rick, and now that you're in the know, having read that, and here's how I kind of sum it up for your listeners. So you've got Bram Stoker, one of 7 children. His 2 sisters were artists, not just painting and sculpting and stuff. But he's got 3 brothers, my great-grandfather being one of the scientists in the family, being medical guys. And another brother, Tom, being a career civil servant. And here is Bram, childhood illness, 7 years, an invalid, something really weird happened. We don't really know what. And he emerged from that. He emerged to then go and become what I believe is probably one of those awkward teenagers that has a fast growth spurt. But he also has an interesting time socializing, as a teenager, as he's come out of his 7-year kind of sarcophagus. And he's now got to enter life and write his exams to get into Trinity. And he does, and he passes them well, and he becomes an athlete, becomes a champion athlete, and he sort of grows into himself. But as he grows into himself, he is what I would imagine, having been a teacher, and I look at people that I have taught and coached, what's their operating system? It's like, it is iOS, this, what is it? And I think Bram was about 50-50 of this analytical, detail-oriented person who became the clerk in the Petty Sessions Legal Department, became the inspector of all clerks all over Ireland, and wrote a legal manual for all the clerks in Ireland. So that very legal, detail-oriented guy. But then there was the dreamer. There was the writer, the guy that actually drew pictures and got awards as a kid, the guy that loved the theater, the escapism of your imagination. So you've got both of those things in Bram's brain almost battling against each other for supremacy. What is he going to be when he grows up? And in an interesting way, even though he excelled at Trinity, he was the head of the Philosophical Society, the Historical, he had a master's in maths. There's that detail side.
Right.
He got the perfect job working for Henry Irving as his theater manager, because this job allowed him to combine both of these traits that I'm talking about. As a theater manager, he had to write contracts, he had to keep the ledgers, everything organized to make sure it all worked right on schedule. But he also had to manage Henry Irving, this super egomaniac, this creative guy that was always trying to be lavish. They'd worked together on adapting scripts to bring out the best in Irving, the best in Ellen Terry. So it suited him just great. And on top of that, in his spare time, he gets to write. He gets to, and as you know from Stoker on Stoker, I was lucky to find Bram Stoker's Lost Journal and publish that with a fellow Canadian Elizabeth Miller from
Okay.
University of Toronto, and that gave us a look into exactly the Bram Stoker I'm describing now. This guy struggling to become a writer, but also very interested in social concerns and so on as he was growing up.
Yeah, and he really came across as a true Renaissance man of the time. It seemed like he was, like you said, he was, and it was so strange because normally for those folks that kind of have, as far as their personality goes, in a sense, where they've got like that split brain with the right and the left, where they've got like just a perfect immersion or a perfect blend rather of having that creative side and that analytical side. Not many people can do both with great precision. Usually they kind of sway one way or the other, and it really seems like Bram was, straight down the middle, and he was able to just basically pick and choose as depending on what results he wanted to get. It was fascinating to me that he had that,
And
and
he
then of course the
excelled.
social aspect of it as well.
And when Bram Stoker chose one path or the other, as you just said so well, he threw all in. He was all in on something. When he got promoted to be the inspector of petty sessions throughout all of Ireland, which meant, funnily enough, he would have to leave Dublin Castle and take carriages and trains to travel all throughout Ireland to go and check on the different counties to make sure that the clerks were doing what they're supposed to doing to make the legal system work properly. So imagine for a moment, and this is what I do often, Rick. Imagine where he got ideas for that feeling of Jonathan Harker getting on a carriage, getting on a train, going to a foreign land, going to a foreign place where maybe he didn't quite know how everything worked, but he had to figure it out as he went. Just like, him going to Count Dracula's castle and bringing all the information about the land transactions that he was representing the Hawkins law firm for. Here he is having to go to these different counties and making sure, and maybe they were not always the most friendly of places because they
Right.
didn't want the inspector to roll in, and see what they were doing wrong.
Yeah.
And Bram found a lot of things going wrong. So what did he do? He went back to his boss and said, I'm going to write a manual. This was not something his boss told him to do. It was something he recognized, and his instinct and his drive said, I got to fix this. And it's really cool because I was just able
It is
to
cool.
buy one of these things, Rick, on auction. It cost me a lot of money. There's not many in circulation still, even though they were in use up until 1960 in Ireland in all the court systems. But I'm
Wow.
sure nobody recognized how valuable they were. And I'm sure once they got the new updated version on their computers or whenever they
Yeah.
came, that they probably just, as they say, binned them, threw them
Yeah.
out. But I'm lucky enough to get one, and it's so cool to look through it because it's so Bram. He even left pages, blank pages with notes, the word notes, so that the clerk could write notes. He gave templates of letters, the way you're supposed to write a letter to somebody. And this is
Wow.
what Bram's life was. He wrote thousands of letters, for correspondence for the Lyceum
Yeah.
Theater. And guess what? Dracula was all letters and journals and things like that. So what we see is him running his life and doing things the right way, but it also kind of bled into the fabric of the stories that he wrote. You could see him come out of these things based on his wiring system.
But what blows me away is the fact that Bram was such a big part of a book that had really such a little role in his own personal life, and to me, I always found that might have been the most fascinating thing that I took away from reading the book Stoker on Stoker. It's, I know, in a sense, it's incredible to me, and I also found that a little bit sad as well that Bram didn't quite get the notoriety that maybe he should have gotten from Dracula, but that everything that he stood for in his life and all his life experiences literally, no pun intended, were literally bled
Yeah,
into the book
yeah.
and the making of Dracula so thoroughly.
Well, I'm glad you recognize that. Some people do, but you also have to go a little deeper into Bram's psyche and realize, yeah, it was sad, but first of all, Bram didn't write anything about himself, really. He mentioned in the book he wrote about Henry Irving called Personal Reminiscence of Henry Irving, and he wrote it very shortly after Irving died. And he wrote a few things about himself in that. Irving and I did this. We did this. And he mentioned about his childhood illness. I never knew what it was like to stand upright, and the experience helped give me make me so thoughtful and all this other interesting stuff. But he wasn't a man that required the spotlight. He wasn't a man that needed all the reviews and the articles. I think he was that man that really wanted and had great satisfaction of being the second in command, that got great satisfaction making things work. And I say that because the theater, and it must be put in perspective, is what he was drawn to, because he would go and watch theatrical performances with his dad for entertainment. But when Bram took a trip to Paris with some of his buddies from Dublin Castle, and he met the actress Genevieve Ward, American-Cuban actress, and he was smitten by her, and he was also smitten by up close and personal famous person of the theater. He came back and told his dad that he's going to write a play for Genevieve Ward. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a big thing for a guy to do, especially when he's on a path for his father, who had retired as a 50-year clerk or secretary in the Dublin Castle. His dad needed somebody in the family, even though he had a decent pension, to be a wage earner. So Bram was it. Child number 3 was making money while all the others are studying medicine and so on. But father writes a letter to Bram and says, the theater is no place for you. You've got a good job as a civil servant. Essentially, lower your aspirations, young man. Don't, stay in your lane. This is it. And I think, Rick, that this was a really traumatic moment for Bram. And I think what it did was set him on a course to make something of the theater, prove his father wrong. So when he met Henry Irving in Dublin after Bram wrote a glowing review of Irving playing Hamlet in Dublin, Irving said, I need to meet this writer, and they met at the Shelburne Hotel. And this is where they really bonded on how the theater needed to be, how to change the theater that at the time used to be not much more sophisticated than a carnival. And actors didn't always wear the right costumes, didn't have the right dialects, they forgot their lines, they were often drunk, they weren't the people in the spotlight that actors, are today.
Far from refined, basically.
No, exactly. But when Stoker got the job offer, and within 2 years he was working with Irving, they set off on a course to do that. And I've read articles by them and about them on what was then going on in the theater. Bram made sure that all the details were taken care of. He even brought in the idea of the deadheads, which is when all seats weren't sold, to encourage the actors and actresses to really give a great performance that night. They would bring people off the street to sit in those extra chairs for free, to give the appearance of a sold-out house, not only to the actors and actors, but to the journalists, reviewers, and everybody else. So I'll cut this part short, but this was Bram's way to operate, to do things right, all in. Him and Irving were going to make sure that the theater now is the place to be. It attracted all realms of society, all the way up to the royals. And as a result of all this, Henry Irving was the first actor ever knighted. And Bram Stoker gets an awful lot of sort of praise for that and credit for that package deal. Bram took care of everything else so Irving could do his thing, which was incredible method acting and so on. And so I think the satisfaction that Bram had, even though we get back to the original point, is that he didn't really get that much accolades for Dracula. I think he got a lot of satisfaction out of having the theater work properly, having Irving knighted, And something he did in a sideline was not steal the spotlight from his boss, which was the main job with his writing,
Right.
but do a good job with the writing. And as we have found out, which is another interesting slight digression for a moment,
Yeah.
originally, Rick, biographers have said, oh, Dracula was only met with mixed reviews when it was first published. Well, a good friend of mine, a Professor John Edgar Browning from Atlanta, who's now at Savannah College of Art and Design as an English teacher, did some interesting research and wrote a book called Forgotten Writings of Bram Stoker. And he looked into that sort of byline, Dracula's met with mixed reviews. And he found that the biographers that have kept repeating that phrase only referred to about 7 or 8 reviews that they had access to, where 2 or 3 were glowing, 1 or 2 were okay, and 1 wasn't so good. So they were right, met with mixed reviews. But Browning had access to more search engines and much more digitization. And a few years ago, this book came out, and he found 100 reviews around the world before Bram died. And those 100 reviews, I give or take 1 or 2, still the vast majority were glowing, and some were middle of the road, but only a very few were negative. And the ones that were negative, Rick, were all about, oh my gosh, how could Bram Stoker have done this? This is such a grotesque and horrifying story. Are you ready for this? This is something how can we possibly fathom this in our fine city of San Francisco or Leeds or somewhere? So that it wasn't that it was a bad book. It was almost too much to take at the time.
Right. And it seemed like a lot of people just weren't ready for it.
That's right.
It's like that scene at Back to the Future where Marty McFly is playing Johnny Be Good, and it's an incredible song, but people just aren't ready for it yet.
That's a good, I've never thought of that analogy, but you're right. That is it. They weren't ready for it. And, again, put it in perspective. Frankenstein comes out in 1818. The Vampire, John Polidori, 1819. And then there's this 80-year gap until 1897. Bram Stoker's Dracula comes out. But unlike Frankenstein and John Polidori and even Carmilla, the Irish vampire story, and Barney the Vampire, this one takes place in real time. 1893 is when Bram set the story. And in real places. Just as you said, it made the way you read the story, it made you feel like Bram had visited Transylvania. He certainly visited Whitby and London and all the other places within London, the London Zoo, Purfleet, Exeter. All these streets were all normal. The cafes, the restaurants, the banks, they were all places that people were familiar with. And therefore, Bram gave this opportunity for what they say for the willful suspension of disbelief. And it made people feel like, my gosh, maybe this vampire story is real after all.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, and I love the fact that you did include some of the reviews in that book, Stoker on Stoker as well. And it was great because, like you said, I mean, it's kind of fascinating in one sense because I'm reading all these and I'm like, people haven't changed. The mass media, you're always going to get the wrong people reviewing the wrong stuff. And of course, they're going to have their own expectations, biased expectations as part of the review. I think that's just natural. But then I was reading some of the reviews that were, the quote unquote poor reviews with, oh, this is so grotesque. And oh, how could a man of his stature write such a terrible thing? And, grabbing at the lowest hanging fruit, etc. And I'm thinking, I was talking to an author a little bit ago where he got a review that somebody said, this is the most disgusting, vile book I've ever read. And for him, because of that niche market, I'm like, that's not a poor review, that's a promotional blurb.
yeah, that's good.
It's like the person just shouldn't be reading that, but that's a promotional blurb, but that's the point is. And I could imagine, that Bram would have read such a review and he would have been happy about that because it seems like he was very results oriented. I think he probably would have really appreciated the fact that he was able to bring just, a common person into his fold and he was able to affect him that way. Why would he want to have somebody read this, think, and if they came away from it thinking, that they were disturbed and they were, you know, put off by this, I'm sure Bram would have appreciated that, I would think, because that's what any artist wants, is to affect somebody for better or for worse. I mean, it's like, and I think he probably would have appreciated those reviews, maybe even more than the ones that were very positive that put him in that limelight.
That's a really good point. And I think of this a little bit. How has Bram's role as a theater manager and all the things he and Irving do, fine tuning and changing scripts from one performance to another. What response did Irving get from the audience with this line or that line? And they would be aware of that, obviously. And I think, Rick, that you hit on something here, that Bram was very sensitive to that. 27 years he did that with Irving. And I think that a lot of that did get, that woven into the fabric of Dracula. I'll go a step further for a moment because, obviously this is a big part of the theater. And that is, as Bram is creating Dracula, and you've now seen all the references to the London Library, which is a huge recent discovery, huge, finding all these books, 26 books that Bram used and noted in the back of his the notes that are in the Rosenbach Museum. These are my research books, much like a student would do when they're doing a paper, right? So what Bram did was he did a combination of hard research. He had a lot of, I believe, personal experiences growing up in Ireland, which has a great history of storytellers and folklore mythology that has their own versions of banshees and pukas and changelings and vampires. But I think what was really influential was watching Henry Irving play the role of Mephistopheles, the devil, in the play Faust. Stoker and Irving and the Lyceum Troupe took these plays very seriously. They actually went to Nuremberg, Germany to research what the castles would look like so that they could do accurate set designs. This is kind of how lavish Irving was. And here was Bram Stoker having to run the ledger book to say, okay, we're going off on an R&D trip. We can't just go onto Google and check it out.
Right.
So they had an expensive trip, but they were looking at it to make, they even would bring Mr. Loveday, the stage manager, and funnily enough, Joseph Harker, the painter of the sets, would go on these trips with them. And then they would come back to London and try to, make it all work so they'd get a good representation. But imagine Bram as he is doing this research at the London Library, blending in all his ideas of folklore and superstition and mesmerism and spiritualism. But he watches Henry Irving play the devil. And I got to give you a little secret here. One of the pieces that shows up in my new annotated Dracula, with all the pieces taken out from the Dracula typescript, there's actually a passage that references Mephistopheles. And it is, remember the scene, Rick, where the band of heroes break into the room to rescue Mina when she is being forced to drink blood from Count Dracula?
Yeah.
He cuts his chest and pushes her face into his chest. When the band of heroes breaks in, and it's a great scene in different movies too. I love the scene in the Coppola movie, the 92 Coppola, when they do this.
Right, yeah.
But in the book, Harker is, in his journal, is describing that the Count was, when they produced the cross, was cowering as Mephistopheles would cower at the cross for Marguerite. So Bram actually had that as a line in the story, which means to me, Rick, that there's no question he had this in his head, that vision of Irving playing this role, that this is a devil, that he borrowed the name from Vlad the Impaler from Count, his Prince Dracula be Count Dracula. It was a devil.
Yeah.
And
That's
for
incredible.
whatever reason, it was cut out. And you can see it struck through. Just as you'll see it in my new book coming out, what cool things like that were cut out, what didn't make it to the final edition.
Yeah, well, it sounds like Bram had a lot more faith in the intelligence of his readers than his publisher did. If they're telling cut all these things out for fear of confusing them, and it's incredible that it's after all these years, 125 years, here we are. We're finally going to get the author's preferred edition of Dracula, which I don't think anybody would have expected. And I mean, that's got to be such a rush for you, too, Dacre, that after all these years and after all the research, that you're still finding all this incredible material that's out there and available. And it makes you wonder what else might be actually out there.
Well, it does.
It's
And
yet to be discovered.
Rick, I got to give a shout out to two fellow Canadians as we talk about that. And you're right, it is a huge rush. But Dr. Elizabeth Miller, who passed away during this pandemic, originally from Newfoundland, had been teaching at U of T. She was a groundbreaker in Bram Stoker Dracula research. And she was one of the people that deciphered and published the Dracula notes that live in the Rosenbach Museum. She was one of my main mentors. We actually worked together on Bram Stoker's Lost Journal and had that published in 2012. And then the other one is Robert 18 Basang from Vancouver. Him and Miller worked together on those Dracula notes I just mentioned. He did all kinds of interesting things and contributions to vampires in general, to vampire literature. He had an incredible collection of vampire books. We worked together on this annotated Dracula that I've been talking about. He was the one that had access to the typescript and, of course, an intimate knowledge of the notes. I contributed what I did from the journal. But he also passed away during the pandemic. He had a heart attack. And 2 weeks after, it wasn't from COVID, thankfully, but 2 weeks after we'd finished working on our manuscript and ready to go to publishers, he had a heart attack and went into the hospital and ended up passing away. So those two were main mentors and partners in writing, partners in crime, that I really feel I feel a duty not only to bring Bram's legacy to the forefront, but to honor these two people that taught me so much and had a real huge impact on many other researchers and scholars in the world of Bram Stoker and Dracula studies, to keep their memories alive. They had lots of awards and so on, but still they were passionate. They were contributors, and they were not always seeking the limelight themselves. So I'm really proud to be able to do this to both of them in my ongoing, podcasts and lectures and things that I publish is recognize them. And there's others, obviously, that have done really, really good stuff and continue to do really good stuff that all contributes. And a lot of this ends up in the BramStokerEstate.com website that my wife and I manage. Any research that comes in that people are willing to share with us, we put it on there, and we're just so glad we've brought the interest of not just Bram but the rest of his siblings, to the light. And always cool things to find. I mean, here's one this is how kind of crazy it is, and it has to do, Rick, I think, with as more archives and museums around the world get more funding. Some of it's crowdfunding, some of it's donations, whatever. They're able to digitize more things. And when they digitize them, obviously they're now out accessible to search engines.
Right.
But also people have come out of the woodwork, I believe, since 2012, the 100th anniversary of Bram's passing. And they're doing it now in the 125th as well, is when people like myself and other folks who are publicizing Bram Stoker and Dracula and tours to Transylvania and to Scotland, where he wrote the story, and London and Whitby, that people are now recognizing the value of some of these cool things that they have, letters, signed books, and so on. And so my wife and I have Google alerts out anytime something pops up that has Bram's name associated. And I occasionally spend far too much money than I should. But to me, it's gold. And here is one thing that I found that is really interesting to me personally. I think maybe your listeners will like it too. Knowing what happened to Bram when Henry Irving died in 1905, I think it was, 4 or 5, that his life as the theater manager was over. His paycheck was over. No pension, no inheritance. He was now on his own. He writes Personal Reminiscence of Henry Irving, which is a bestseller. But he's also trying to stay productive, but his health is beginning to fail him as well. And he continues to go to a wonderful little town in Scotland, about 40 minutes north of Aberdeen, called Cruden Bay. It used to be called Port Erroll, Cruden Bay. This is where he wrote Dracula. He wrote Mystery of the Sea. He wrote The Water's Mouth, and he wrote The Lair of the White Worm. It was this sort of writer's retreat. It was almost a spiritualistic retreat.
Yeah, sounds like an amazing place.
It is. I've been there a few times to do my research. I've actually written a book called Slane's Castle with Mike Shepard, Slane's Castle Secret History. Mike wrote a book called Where Brave Men Shudder, detailing Bram's a minimum of 12 visits to this town. We just don't know all the visits because we don't have records of everything.
Sure.
But When Brave Men Shudder by Mike Shepard is great. But here's what I found is a letter that had Bram's home letterhead on it and dated 1906. And he's crossed out his address and written in pen, the Kilmarnock Arms Hotel, Cruden Bay, Scotland.
That's cool.
So I know that he was in that hotel, staying there in 1906 when he wrote this letter, and he wrote it to the American David Bisham. David Bisham was an opera singer. He was a producer of opera, and he was looking for Bram Stoker to manage this opera for about 3 or 4 months for its run in not, I would say Broadway. It was in London.
Yeah.
So Bram was actually talking to him about himself. I'm not sure if I'm ready to go back to the theater right now, but if I do, this is what I used to do for Henry Irving. This is how much I made. This is what I would do for you. If you're still interested, I'll come and do this. So it's this really subtle and an honorable way for a man to come out and say, I'm not really sure if I'm ready for this, but if I do, this is what you can expect from me. He wasn't beating around the bush and trying to get a job when he wasn't ready for it. But it placed Bram in the Kilmarnock Arms Hotel in a date that Mike Shepard and I had not previously known he was actually there. So that's the kind of little gold. So I take that and then I start researching who David Bisham is, what this opera was all about, the Vicar of Wakefield, and what went on, and did Bram did it, and how long did it last, and then what happened afterwards. It sort of fills in some of these pieces of the puzzle that I'm looking for.
That's amazing, and I can see why you're such a lover of the outdoors, and I saw on your social media getting away with fly fishing as well, because I can imagine that you really do need some time away yourself as well, because I can just imagine that this is such an incredible, exciting mystery. I mean, it's just a nonstop investigation for you that you've got to have some time where you can get away from it all and just sort of, let it kind of float on its own, I suppose, because I can imagine that this really would be, I mean, you really would have to be obsessed with this sort of research in order to be able to find all these dots and connect them all, because I'm sure a lot of the dots that you connect, you probably do that sort of in the peripheral of your mind, and as you don't have to, I guess, put them in the spotlight, so to speak, and really concentrate on them. I'm sure as you're fly fishing, you think, oh, wait a second, these two things go together.
It's funny though, Rick, when I do go hiking or fly fishing to wonderful exotic places. Some of them are, back to Western Canada, to Fernie,
Yeah.
British Columbia, or to Montana, or these other cool places. That's when, the mind just relaxes. But occasionally a thought does pop up, and then something does cogitate. Oh my God. And you know what? Just like I do next to my bedside table, I keep a notepad and a pen always handy. Because when you get a cool idea, and for instance, this morning I was dog walking, and I've been asked by Tourism Ireland to produce a short video on what Bram Stoker meant to Ireland, what I think Bram Stoker meant to Ireland. It's a promotion for Halloween.
Yeah. Okay.
And you get these kind of ideas at the strangest moments. And if I don't have a little pad, or the cell phone now has these little note things on it, or even
I use mine religiously. Yeah.
Yeah, but you get these crazy ideas, and they're not always crazy. Some of them ideas have turned into little plot lines in fictional stories.
Sure.
But you know what, though? This is what's so cool about Bram Stoker's Lost Journal. And it all comes back to, I am obsessed with it when I think about it. He did the same thing, Rick. He had this commonplace book that that was found in one of my cousin's attic, that he kept ideas like that, random ideas, things he listened to, things he saw, jokes he heard in a pub, things he heard at work, and he jotted them down. And this is what Elizabeth Miller and I have compiled. And then, because his handwriting is so bad, we had to decipher it and type it up and put it sort of in italics so you can see exactly what Bram wrote and what he was thinking about. But so, like him, I'm aware, no matter where I am, of my surroundings, and sometimes things just trigger thoughts. Bram loved the ocean. He loved swimming in the open water. I've even found a sketch of him fishing. I don't know if it was fly fishing, but I've seen that he was fishing somewhere, just a sketch by some journalist. So, yeah, it's an interesting life. And, because I don't have a full-time job anymore, not being a school teacher or an athletics coach, it just every moment becomes an opportunity for something that either I read or I see that needs to get included into one of the projects that I have going on, or one of the ones that I'm hoping to do. And they all go into a notebook somewhere for them to hopefully arise from later on.
Perfect. Yeah, just like Dracula. So no, that's amazing. No, I mean, it seems like you're not so far removed from Bram as far as your process goes. I mean, the way that you described Cruden Bay, formerly Port Errol, I can just imagine the kind of inspiration that Bram would have gotten, not just from the scenery, but the isolation as well. I think was probably just as much of the part of the process, and it was incredible to me too to hear other people's, their memories of Bram and this wild man out there with his beard and this walking stick and this cloak kind of blowing behind him as he's out there yelling at the sea and really getting into the character of Bram. And I would just imagine that that would have fed into the lore of the book of Dracula as well, where you're thinking that he must have written, from the perspective of this, rebellious devil, and here he is out there screaming at the sea, and you wonder, is this a man that's being, made slightly insane by his own, his own makings, or is this just a man that is so, like you allude to in the book Stoker on Stoker, again, to mention that book, if he was just that much of a method actor that in order to write so vividly about this book and about Dracula and all the other stories that he's written, if it was because he was just constantly putting himself right in there with these devils and these these monsters in this isolated place, it was just very easy to imagine this guy going crazy on there. But in a sense, maybe it was the most sane thing that he did for himself at the time. Maybe it's what kept him sane.
Well, listen, you and I, it's becoming obvious that we think a lot alike. I'll just tell you this: you and your family, you're going to have to go take a trip there someday to experience it, Rick, yourself. It is definitely worth it and interesting. The insight that you just revealed is almost word for word that I have gathered and taken and shared with a fellow author, Dr. Leverett Butts. who we've done a couple of short stories together that have been published in different publications, Weird Tales being one of them.
Yeah.
We are about halfway through working on a fictional story of Bram Stoker writing Dracula, that the one summer, possibly 2 summers, that he was writing Dracula while in Cruden Bay, Scotland. And as you were talking about, and I don't want to give spoilers away, but a possible descent into madness, and how he was handling that, how his family handled that, how those people around him handled that, and what went on. I will give you one more thing for your listeners to cogitate on about Cruden Bay, and I'm sure you've picked up on it. And if not, I highly recommend you guys Google Slains Castle octagonal room. So there was a castle in this town, not a mighty fortress, but a large estate owned by the Earl of Errol. The Errol family was the guy that managed, all the land around there. Everybody, he owned all the land and all that.
Yeah.
And Slains Castle was a wonderful castle at the time. It was in a full splendor. And even though Mike Shepard and I have found no record of Bram Stoker actually going in, and we wouldn't have, because Bram didn't keep a diary, and there's no guest book that anyone's ever found at Slains Castle. There certainly was at the Kilmarnock Arms Hotel.
Yeah.
But we are convinced that Bram Stoker was in there at least once, and we are convinced that, as he described, Bram did in chapter 2, Jonathan Harker's arrival at Castle Dracula, walking up the steps, going to the front door with no knocker, neither did Slains Castle, was welcomed in by the Count. And in chapter 2, as you read that welcoming statement, opens the door, goes through another door, in through a hallway, into an octagonal room with no windows to the outside, lit by a single lamp, that Bram is describing his exact footsteps as he walked into Slains Castle in exactly the same way. I gave this presentation with Mike by my side in the Kilmarnock Arms Hotel a couple of years ago. And the villagers, of course, they know what's going on, because Slains Castle is a ruin now. There's no roof on it. So drone footage as you look down, and that's what I want your listeners to do, is Google Slains Castle drone footage. You can look down and you can see that pathway exactly as Bram described it. Harker walking in the door, through another door, through a hallway, into an octagonal room. The octagonal room is still very visible. The problem is there's no roof and no lamp, as Bram described it. But a man stood up in the back of the Kilmarnock Arms dining room when we gave the speech, and he said, "I have that lamp." And Mike and we looked at each other like, holy smokes. And he goes, and I won't try a Scottish accent, but he said, my name is Robert Hay. I'm a descendant of the Errol family. When our family, our generation, had to leave the castle, and he didn't say this in public, they basically sell the roof, the lead roofing, they sell the paneling, the upholstery, but the family members got to keep some of the cool stuff. And he got that lamp. The one lamp
that was amazing.
And he has it in his home in London, and he sent Mike Shepard and I a picture of the lamp, and it's in Mike's book, When Brave Men Shudder. So that's how incredible. That's how realistic this stuff is, Rick, that I do. I go in these places, never know exactly what I'm finding, but when you go to places like Transylvania and lead tours, or Cruden Bay, Scotland, or Whitby, you find things, you find the right people like Mike Shepard or others that have insight, and I bring a little information to the table. They have information. We put it together, and it's like, oh, wow. Now it opens something up. Like the letter I found by Bisham, I showed it to Mike. He then goes, oh, that means he's here in 1906. Oh, what else is that going to find? He goes, looks at other newspapers in 06 and finds other cool things. It just goes on and opens
up. Like
up.
all these little shining lights just out there to be found.
Exactly. Just makes the picture a little more clear.
And when Bram would he would have assumedly gone into the castle, and it really sounds like he must have. he wasn't supposed to be there, right? From what I understand, like that castle wouldn't have been open to the public, I wouldn't think at the time.
No, he would have been invited in by the Earl.
Oh, okay.
What would have happened is it wasn't a ruin at the time. It was inhabited, but the
Oh,
Earl
okay.
was kind of a strange guy, very, very bit reclusive, and he was
Yeah.
really. It's funny thing that Mike has told me about him. Um, he would have much preferred to be in London with all the hot swells, rather than
Yeah.
isolated up in the middle of nowhere. So it would have made total sense that he would have invited somebody from London who was famous as a theater manager to come up to the castle, come up for a visit. So he would have been invited in, and I'm sure he would have. That the octagonal room was the room where guests were brought into, sort of like a parlor. And I
Sure.
think Bram would have had that little bit of a nervous feeling, like Harker did. I've been invited here. I'm looking around. What am I doing here? What? Who is this guy? What do I expect?
Yeah.
So it is that's part of the mystery is what did he really do there? Of course, Lever Butts and I have a lot of fun with it to create our fictional story about what did Bram feel like, a lot like Harker, and how does Bram get the feeling like he's trapped there, like Harker was on this visit, maybe another one. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it's a good backdrop for what I think is going to be a really cool fictional story, hopefully following like Dracula the Undead and Dracula. Hopefully this will be out in about a year, and it'll
Awesome. I was
pick
going
up
to ask
some
you that.
momentum like that.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And when that's ready to go, I'd love to talk to you about that too. I'd be very fascinated on what you discover from putting yourself even further into Bram's mind through writing that and imagining what his state of mind must have been like when he was producing this amazing book in isolation on the rocky shores of Cruden Bay. I think
Yeah.
sounds like that'll be an amazing experience for you. So, and now, when did you? I mean, obviously, your last name kind of gives it away for you. But when did you realize that you had the heritage that you did have? I mean, you've come from a pretty prominent family as well of scientists and professors and teachers, and then of course in the midst of all this, you've got Bram Stoker and the history of and the legacy of Dracula. When did you first discover that yourself, Dacre?
Well, growing up in Montreal, this is a story everybody wants to know. What was it like? And I hate to disappoint people or your listeners. We weren't like the Munsters or the Addams family. It was a very normal upbringing in Montreal. We had a nice house and we had a library, and around Halloween time, people would come to the door and sort of joke. Now, obviously, their fathers had probably, mothers and fathers had told the kids, it's the Stoker household, better watch out. And the kids would say, "Oh, you're going to give us candy or take our blood?" And I think around the age of 12, I asked my father, I said, "What the heck's going on?" Because I knew about my great-grandfather, George Stoker, who was a famous doctor. I didn't know much about Bram at the age of 12, and he sort of filled me in a little bit. But the funny thing is, Rick, we in Canada didn't really know that much about Bram. We were lucky enough that two Boston College professors, McNally and Floresco, had just written a book called In Search of Dracula, and they were the ones that discovered in the Rosenbach Museum the Dracula notes. And that was our first educational moment, was reading that book.
Okay.
And I read that. I read Dracula. I go off to college, and I read it again when it's time to, in an English literature course, give a report on an author. And I said, okay, this is like in the late 70s, early 80s. It's time to do some digging into the family
Cool.
history a bit. And that's when I found out more. But honestly, I was more interested during those college years to get my degree and to try to make the Olympic team in modern pentathlon for Canada. So I really didn't have this like dark side of me that was developing on the side until years later. Till 2003, I got into it with Ian Holt to write Dracula the Undead. So it was just bits and pieces that sort of entered into life, and then I really got into it in 2003 and started going to museums and archives and libraries and conferences, and just totally immersing myself. And I became the expert in the family and reported back to the others, and started this website, bramstokerestate.com, and writing books and so on. And as I say, the rest is history, but it's been an interesting history and a lot of fun to become the member of the family that is able to be the resource, but also have some fun with it at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to have fun with it. And I know when I first discovered you was through, of course, really through Lynn Hansen, who did, let's bring this a bit closer so that everybody can kind of check this out. We did this beautiful cover on this book. And it was when I chatted with Lynn, she was on my podcast a little while ago, of course, for what the amazing work that she does on book covers. And I thought that was the first time that I heard of it. I didn't post that in the podcast itself because it wasn't public at that time. But, you know, Lynn was kind enough to give me a little bit of a teaser as far as some of the stuff she has in the works. And the moment I found out she was doing that, I thought, whatever it takes, I have to try to get in touch with Dacre, and hopefully he's kind enough and willing to let me chat with him. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little bit disappointed when I first saw your picture, and I thought, he's not this brooding, dark, mystical creature. Like, he's actually a pretty, with all the respect, a pretty ordinary looking guy by all accounts. So now, the only thing I'll give you a little bit of credit, I think, for upholding the legacy and the mysticism behind Dracula is that you put your date of birth at 39. And honestly, I was a little bit surprised about that because you look at least half of that. So I was pretty blown away by that as well. And I thought, what kind of blood must you be bathing in? You look incredible for a man who's been around for a couple of years, since 39. So that was awesome.
So did you actually find a misprint in the book? That's what I need to know, because as far as I know, at least in this life, I was born in 1958.
Oh, okay, yeah, because in there you've got it in as 39, and I'm thinking, wow.
Then I better need to take a look at that. But thank you.
You're welcome. Maybe I should edit that out from the podcast.
No, that's okay. That's cool. We always find these, but I would want you to do one more quick thing.
Please do.
Hold that Dracula that Lynn did the cover back up again.
Sure, you got it.
And Rick, look at it first closely. You look at it, and since we've just finished talking about Cruden Bay, Scotland, here's your host participation time. What is that a picture of right there? What do you think it's a picture of? Well,
I would have guessed before that would have been the castle from Cruden Bay itself, from Slane Castle, because I wasn't sure if it was that or if it was the actual castle that a Bran castle that had more to do with the actual Bram's depiction of Castle Dracula.
Okay, now look at it really closely again, and look at the person walking into that castle. Bottom right-hand side.
Yeah, right over over here.
What do you think that represents now that you know more, since we've just talked about it?
Well, originally I thought, okay, that must have been Jonathan Harker, but I'm now thinking what I do know about this. I think that's Bram overlooking the castle, getting inspired by the story of Dracula.
All right, man, you just hit a center 10, buddy, on both of these things. This is sort of the mystery that Lynn and I wanted to create. Never before has a picture of Slane's Castle in its heyday, the way it looked like when Bram was there, appeared on a cover of Dracula, okay? And that little person down below by your fingertips is supposed to look like both Jonathan Harker and Bram Stoker. It's a what a theater manager would be wearing walking along the street with the bowler hat on and so on.
Okay.
Because, and this is a good way to end the show today, Dracula's castle in the novel is a merger of the internal floor plan of that castle right there. Okay, so the inside of Bram's Dracula's castle is Slane's castle. The exterior is, just as you said, Bran, Bran castle, which is in Brasov, Transylvania.
Okay.
And Bram saw 2 sketches of that castle in 2 of those 26 books that he listed at the back of his Dracula notes. That both of those books live in the London Library and were there when he was a member there, when he was writing the novel. It's the only 2 sketches of any castle in any of the 26 books. So I am
That's
convinced,
incredible.
coming back to the beginning of our show, Bram Stoker, the visual guy, that side of his brain, needed to look at a sketch of a castle in Transylvania as he wrote the description of the exterior, but he placed it 400 miles to the northeast, Transylvania, in a location very near the Borgo Pass. Now, to really bring this all together, again, pieces of a puzzle, Rick, many pieces of the puzzle. One of the books in the London Library, there was 2 of them that he had used for his resource, has accurate maps of Transylvania in it. Both of them have the little lines on the edges of longitude and latitude. Bram's notes in the Rosenbach Museum have a reference to 47 east, 25 3/4 west, where the river Sereth runs into Bystritza at Fundu. All of this helped me pinpoint exactly, and also this researcher, Hans de Roos, who originally discovered all this, deciphered where Bram Stoker planned to place that climactic battle at the end of the novel, as the band of heroes are moving in on the gypsies who are protecting the Count in the litter wagon in his crate just before the sun goes down and he can escape into his castle up on top of Mount Israel.
Right.
This is his location of the castle. Spoiler alert, there is no castle there. I've been there with my son. It's an extinct volcano, which plays into the story.
Yeah.
But he merged these other 2 castles for what he needed to be the perfect castle on top of this mountain.
Just the insight that went into that was incredible.
Yeah, and that's Bram. That is Dacre Stoker, his great-grandnephew, explaining to you part of Bram's process for one of the the coolest endings in the story. And to really finish this podcast off with a bang, the original ending of Dracula that I discovered out in Seattle, Paul Allen Estate owns this original typescript, and this is going to appear in my upcoming annotated Dracula with Robert Bassang. The original ending of Dracula was edited out. It's crossed out. You can see it plain as day. There was a volcanic eruption right after the Count crumbled into dust after the Bowie knife went into his heart. Only Bram Stoker would be that detail-oriented that if he was planning a volcanic eruption, by God, he was going to make sure that that castle was sitting on a volcano. And Mount Israel at 47 25 3/4 latitude, that was an extinct volcano.
That's incredible. And I can't, you don't mess with an ending. So I'm so grateful that you're able to piece all that together to give us the original ending. That's amazing.
There we go.
Can you imagine people have grown up with Dracula all this time and they still haven't read the real Dracula the way that it was meant to have been presented to the masses 125 years ago? That's amazing.
They will soon. When my book comes out, Robert Bassang, my book comes out from Hellbound Publishing. It'll be out soon, and it'll show lots of the little things like this that were cut out, inserted back in again, and as you said earlier in the show, it's like a big, massive puzzle. I keep finding things, and we'll keep updating people as they go. And Stoker on Stoker Volume 3 will be out sometime, and maybe I'll find more things for another version of the annotated Dracula at some point.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Dacre, for all the work that you do, keeping the legacy alive and undead in all of its glory. And I really appreciate putting all those pieces together. And thanks as well, of course, all your contributors. It really sounds like it's been a group effort. You've been leading the charge, but it really sounds like it's been a group effort to try to find all these little beacons and shining lights from the man in the back of the room to everything else that might not be so obvious.
Absolutely. Well, Rick, thank you for your interest. It's guys like you that keep the whole horror genre alive on Dark Bites.
Yes.
It's a pleasure chatting with somebody who researches so well, comes up with great questions, and makes an hour go by like nothing.
I know,
So,
right?
yeah, thank you very
Yeah, well,
much.
thank you very much as well.
Absolutely.
Vampires, Dracula specifically has always been my first true love of horror. I hope we get to do this again sometime. Like you said, an hour flew by, and I feel like there's so many more questions and things that I'd love to talk to you about. But perhaps we can meet again when the next edition of your findings comes out.
Absolutely. And big shout out to the 120th anniversary of Bram Stoker's Dracula.
That's
And,
great.
Rick, I got to get your address. I want to send you one of these things in the mail. So
that'd be incredible.
When the show's done, as a thank you, shoot me your address. It might take Pony Express to get up to there from South Carolina, but we'll get it there somehow. And thank you all so much.
Perfect. Hey, is there any other way to deliver Dracula but by Pony Express? So
it makes sense, wouldn't it?
100%. Thank you very much, Dacre.
Good night, everybody.
You too.